Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a Jehovah's Witness publication from the 1980s or 1990s. What comes to mind? If you were ever part of that world, or even if you simply passed by their literature stands, the imagery was unmistakable. Children laughing while playing with lions. Families of every ethnicity building wooden houses in lush green valleys. Baskets overflowing with exotic fruits. Crystal waterfalls cascading into pristine lakes. Elderly couples, suddenly young again, embracing loved ones who had risen from the grave. The visual and textual message was relentlessly optimistic. Hold on just a little longer. The paradise is right around the corner. You will live forever. You will never grow old. You will see your dead grandmother again. The theology was built entirely on reward, on restoration, on eternal life in a peaceful earth transformed into a garden. But now, open the publications from 2024. Open the new study book released for 2025, titled Walk Courageously with God. The climate has changed drastically. The warm sunlight has given way to shadows. The tranquil smiles have been replaced by tense faces, beads of sweat rolling down foreheads. The country cottages and gardens have disappeared. In their place, you find dark basements, cramped attics, and locked doors. The dominant visual narrative today is not freedom in the New World. It is the constant threat of militarized police breaking down your door. What happened to the organization of God? Why has a religion that spent a century preaching global expansion and explosive growth now begun training the minds of its faithful to hide in bunkers? In this documentary, we are going to conduct a deep, forensic analysis of the 2025 study book. We will not merely read it. We will dissect it. We will prove, using their own documents, principles of psychology and theology, that this publication is not a manual of faith. It is a manual of psychological survival created by a leadership that knows it is under siege. But this siege does not come from Satan. It does not come from abstract religious persecution. The siege comes from human justice. It comes from democratic governments that are finally saying, enough. And to keep you loyal while the ship sinks, the leadership needs you to be terrified of the outside world. To prove the devastating human cost of this strategy, we will expose the story of Alfredo Fernandez, a young man the new book presents as a hero of faith, but whose death exposes perhaps the greatest and cruelest doctrinal contradiction in the entire history of the Watchtower organization. Before we open the 2025 book, we need to understand why it exists. And for that, we need to look at numbers. Not the numbers the Watchtower proudly announces at conventions, but the numbers they hope you never calculate yourself. During the 1980s and early 1990s, Jehovah's Witnesses were growing at over 5% per year. This was genuine expansion. New converts were flooding in. Kingdom halls were being built. The organization could point to its growth as evidence of divine blessing. In the 5 years before 1975, the annual growth rate hit 13%. The end was near, the message was urgent, and people were responding. Then something changed. Starting in 1995, the growth rate began a steady, relentless decline. By 2019, growth had dropped to just 1.32%, barely above the world's population growth rate. This means that, despite 2 billion hours of preaching per year, the organization was essentially just treading water, converting barely enough new people to replace the children of members who leave. Let me give you a number that should stop every Jehovah's Witness in their tracks. In 2022, it took over 10,000 hours of preaching to produce a single baptism. 10,000 hours. That is 5 people working full-time for an entire year to bring in 1 person. And because of deaths and people leaving, it took 40,000 hours of preaching just to increase the total membership by 1 single person. Here is another calculation the governing body does not want you to make. In the 10 years between 2011 and 2020, Jehovah's Witnesses reported 2.7 million baptisms. Nearly 3 million people getting dunked in pools at conventions around the world. But during that same period, the net increase in average publishers was only 1.2 million. That means 1.5 million people, more than half of all those baptized, left or became inactive within a decade. The organization has the highest turnover rate of any mainstream religion. This is not a growing movement. It is a revolving door. If growth had continued at the 5% rate of the early 1990s, there would be over 20 million Jehovah's Witnesses today. Instead, there are around 9 million. 12 million people who statistically should exist never materialized. That is not a minor shortfall. That is an organizational catastrophe. Consider Australia, one of the most well-documented examples. In 1998, there was one Jehovah's Witness for every 294 people in Australia. By 2024, that ratio had fallen to 1 in 384. The organization is not just failing to grow in proportion to the population. It is shrinking relative to the society around it. What happened in 1995? That was the year the Watchtower revised its teaching on the generation. For decades, they had taught that the generation alive in 1914 would not pass away before Armageddon arrived. By 1995, those people were dying of old age, and the promised end had not come. The governing body quietly changed the doctrine, and members started leaving. The second factor was the Internet. Before the mid-1990s, a Jehovah's Witness who had doubts had limited options. The local library might have a critical book or two, but finding it required effort and risked being seen. The Internet changed everything. Suddenly, with a few keystrokes, anyone could find court documents, academic research, testimonies from former members, and the organization's own historical publications that contradicted current teachings. The information quarantine was breached. In November 2023, the governing body made an announcement that perfectly illustrates their awareness of this crisis. They eliminated the requirement for regular publishers to report their preaching hours. For over a century, our reporting had been the organizational heartbeat. Every month, every publisher, from children to the elderly, had to report exactly how many hours they spent in the ministry. This data was tabulated, analyzed, and used to track the health of the organization. And suddenly, they stopped collecting it. Why? Because the numbers were devastating. The average hours per publisher had been declining for years. Pioneers were not meeting their quotas. The data painted a picture of an exhausted, demoralized membership. Rather than confront that reality, the governing body simply stopped measuring it. You cannot fail a test you refuse to take. These are not the metrics of a divinely blessed organization on the verge of ushering in paradise. These are the vital signs of an institution in crisis. And the 2025 book is the leadership's response to that crisis. To understand the shift from paradise to bunker, we need to recognize a fundamental change in motivational theology. For most of the 20th century, Jehovah's Witnesses operated on what psychologists call positive reinforcement. The primary motivator was pleasure, specifically the anticipation of future pleasure. You endure suffering now because soon, very soon, you will receive an unimaginable reward. Paradise, resurrection, eternal youth, perfect health, a world without death. This message was extraordinarily effective during periods of growth. When the organization was expanding, when new members were flooding in, when the future seemed bright and the end felt imminent, hope was a powerful engine. People sacrificed careers, education, families, and financial security because they genuinely believed they would never need those things. Why plan for retirement when you will be petting a panda in paradise within 5 years? But hope has a structural weakness. It requires delivery. And the Watchtower has now spent over 140 years promising an end that refuses to arrive. The generation of 1914 has died. The people who were supposed to never taste death are buried in cemeteries around the world. The children who were told not to pursue education because Armageddon was imminent in 1975 are now retirement age, many of them with nothing. When hope is repeatedly deferred, it does not simply weaken. It begins to corrode. Members start asking uncomfortable questions. They notice that the generation teaching has been modified multiple times. They notice that the goalposts keep moving. And in the Internet age, they can research the organization's failed predictions with a few keystrokes. So what does a leadership do when its primary motivator is failing? It pivots. It switches from positive reinforcement to negative reinforcement. Instead of saying, stay because something wonderful is coming, it begins to say, stay because something terrible is already here. The carrot gives way to the stick. This is not speculation. This is observable in their own publications. Beginning around 2016, Watchtower video productions began featuring increasingly dystopian scenarios. The famous bunker videos showed witnesses hiding in basements while police raided their homes. The imagery shifted from gardens to garages, from reunions to raids. The dominant emotion being cultivated was no longer anticipation. It was fear. Fear is a remarkably effective tool of retention. When you are afraid, you do not think clearly. Your amygdala hijacks your prefrontal cortex. You seek safety in the familiar. You become suspicious of outsiders. You are more willing to follow orders without questioning them, because questioning feels like a luxury you cannot afford when survival is at stake. The bunker narrative accomplishes something the paradise narrative never could. It creates immediate dependence. In the paradise theology, you needed the organization to eventually get you to the reward. But in the bunker theology, you need the organization right now, this very moment, to survive the imminent attack. The organization becomes your bomb shelter, your militia, your only protection against a hostile world. And here is the most insidious element. The bunker also functions as an information quarantine. When you believe the world outside is actively trying to destroy you, you stop engaging with it. You stop reading newspapers. You stop talking to neighbors. You certainly stop clicking on links that might contain apostate information. The bunker is not just physical. It is mental. And once a member is inside that mental bunker, they become nearly unreachable. Now let us turn to the documentary evidence. The 2025 study book, Walk Courageously with God, is not merely a collection of Bible stories. It is a carefully constructed psychological manual designed to prepare members for a very specific kind of obedience. Let me show you exactly how this works. Chapter 13. Training for Illogical Obedience. Turn to page 66 of the PDF. The book explicitly states, and I quote, "The instruction that Joshua received from Jehovah on how to attack Jericho did not make sense from a military standpoint." Read that sentence again. The organization is openly admitting that God's command appeared irrational. Marching around walls instead of attacking. Blowing trumpets instead of battering rams. The military experts of the day would have called it madness. Now, why would the Watchtower highlight the apparent irrationality of a divine command? Because they are laying the psychological groundwork for a doctrine that has been building for over a decade, the doctrine of illogical obedience. Connect this to the November 15th, 2013 Watchtower, page 20, paragraph 17. That article stated, "At that time, the direction that we receive from Jehovah's organization may not appear practical from a human standpoint." That was not an abstract theological musing. That was a warning. They were telling members in advance that instructions would come that seemed nonsensical, and that true faithfulness meant obeying anyway. The 2013 article was the theoretical announcement. The 2025 book is the practical training manual. The chapter is teaching members to override their own rational faculties when instructions from leadership seem strange. The courage being demanded is not courage to face enemies. It is courage to silence your own logic. It is courage to obey orders that do not make sense to you. In any other context, we would recognize this as the psychology of authoritarian control. But wrapped in biblical narrative, it becomes faithfulness. Chapter 36. Manufacturing Family Betrayal. Turn to pages 162 through 165. The book praises King Josiah for acting against the idolatry of his own father, Ammon, and his grandfather. The text presents Josiah as a hero precisely because he was willing to oppose his own blood relatives in the name of serving Jehovah. Understand the psychological application here. This chapter is preparing members for shunning. It is teaching them that courage includes acting against family members who do not serve Jehovah according to organizational standards. The implicit message is clear. If your parents, your siblings, your children leave the organization or are disfellowshipped, you must have the courage to cut them off. This is not incidental. This is structurally vital to the organization's survival. Sociological research consistently shows that the single greatest predictor of whether someone leaves a high control group is the strength of their external social connections. If you have strong relationships outside the organization, with non-witness family, with old friends, with coworkers, you have a safety net. You have somewhere to go if you leave. The organization knows this, and so it systematically works to sever those external bonds. It discourages friendships with worldly people. It discourages higher education, which creates diverse social networks. And it demands that members cut off any family who leave. The Josiah chapter is the theological justification for this isolation strategy. It teaches that betraying your own family, if they are not loyal to the organization, is not cruelty. It is courage. Chapter 37. Locking in decisions before the crisis. Turn to page 166. The book focuses on Daniel 1 verse 8, which states that Daniel resolved in his heart not to defile himself with the king's food. The key phrase is resolved in his heart. The book emphasizes that Daniel made his decision before the crisis arrived. This is a psychological concept called pre-commitment. You make a binding decision while you are calm, rational, and under no pressure, so that when the crisis comes, you do not have to think. You simply execute the decision you already made. The organization uses this technique extensively. The most significant example is the blood doctrine. Members are required to sign advance medical directives refusing blood transfusions while they are healthy and not facing any immediate medical crisis. The document is designed to remove choice at the moment when choice matters most. When you are bleeding on an operating table, when your child is dying, when every instinct screams for you to accept the treatment that could save your life, you cannot. You already decided. The document already speaks for you. The Daniel chapter is training members to lock in organizational loyalty before any crisis tests it. It is preparing them to be incapable of changing their minds when new information arrives or when circumstances change. This is not faithfulness. This is psychological binding. Now we come to the most damning evidence in the entire book. Turn to page 256 of the PDF. In the section titled, Imitate Their Example of Courage, you will find a photograph of a young man named Alfredo Oscar Fernandez. The book presents him as a hero, a model of courage, someone whose example should inspire young Jehovah's Witnesses today to stand firm even unto death. Let me tell you who Alfredo Fernandez was. In 1982, Argentina was ruled by a brutal military dictatorship. The country was also engaged in the Falklands War, known in Argentina as the Malvinas War, a conflict with Great Britain. The military government was drafting young men. Alfredo was 19 years old. At that time, Watchtower policy absolutely prohibited Jehovah's Witnesses from performing any form of military or alternative civilian service. The organization taught that accepting alternative service was a compromise, a tacit endorsement of the military system. A young witness could not simply say, "I will not carry a weapon, but I will work in a hospital or plant trees instead." The organization said no. Any form of government service connected to the conscription system was forbidden. Alfredo, following this doctrine, refused not only to fight but even to wear the military uniform. He would not participate in any capacity. He was arrested. He was detained by the Argentine military during one of the darkest periods of its dictatorship. And under circumstances that have never been fully investigated, Alfredo Oscar Fernandez died in military custody. He was 19 years old. The 2025 book presents his photo alongside a caption encouraging young people to be courageous like him. It holds him up as an example of faithfulness unto death. Now let me tell you what the book does not tell you. 14 years after Alfredo died, the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses changed the rule that killed him. The May 1, 1996 Watchtower, pages 19 and 20, announced that alternative civilian service was now a matter of personal conscience. A Jehovah's Witness could choose to accept such service without organizational penalty. The very position for which Alfredo gave his life was reversed. The line in the sand that he died defending was erased. Think about that. If Alfredo Fernandez had been born in 1978 instead of 1963, he would have been draft age in 1996 instead of 1982. And he would be alive today. He could have accepted alternative service. He could have worked in a civilian capacity. He could have had a career, a family, grandchildren. He could be sitting somewhere right now, an old man in his 60s, looking back on a full life. But he was born 15 years too early. And the Watchtower's doctrinal rigidity killed him. This is not a peripheral issue. The organization using his photograph in 2025 to inspire courage in young people without disclosing that they themselves reversed the doctrine that caused his death is a profound moral failure. They are asking children to be willing to die for organizational policies while knowing, from their own history, that those policies can be changed at any moment. Alfredo did not die for an eternal divine law. He died for an organizational interpretation that the organization itself later admitted was not binding. His courage was exploited to enforce a temporary policy. And now, nearly 30 years after that policy was reversed, his face is being used to recruit the next generation of potential martyrs. Part 6. The Legal Siege. We now arrive at the question of motivation. Why is the Watchtower pivoting so aggressively to bunker theology? Why is fear replacing hope? The answer is not spiritual. It is legal and institutional. The Watchtower organization is facing an unprecedented wave of legal challenges across the democratic world. And rather than reform its practices, leadership has chosen to reframe these challenges as evidence of satanic persecution. The bunker is not preparation for Armageddon. It is a psychological barrier against external information that might cause members to question the organization. Norway. The case that reveals the strategy. Let me walk you through what has been happening in Norway, because it perfectly illustrates the pattern. In 2022, the Norwegian government stripped the Jehovah's Witnesses organization of its official religious registration and all associated public subsidies. This was not an act of religious persecution by an authoritarian regime. This was Norway, consistently ranked among the most free and human rights protective nations on earth. The core issue was shunning, particularly the shunning of minors. Norwegian law requires registered religious communities to respect the right of members to leave without facing organized social sanctions. The government examined the witnesses' practice of disfellowshipping and concluded that it constitutes a form of negative social control that violates fundamental rights, especially when applied to children who were baptized as minors. In March 2024, the Oslo District Court upheld the government's decision. The court stated that children's right to freedom of expression was violated by the exclusion practice. The judges found that shunning created such severe exit costs that members were effectively prevented from freely leaving the organization. But here is where it gets complicated. In March 2025, the Borgarting Court of Appeal unanimously overturned the lower court's ruling. 3 appeal judges determined that the shunning practice, while unpleasant, did not rise to the level of psychological violence, and that the government had not met its burden of proof. The Norwegian government then appealed to the Supreme Court. In August 2025, the Supreme Court accepted the case. As of the filming of this documentary, the final ruling is pending. This will be the 4th round of legal battle between the Watchtower and the Norwegian state. But here is what matters for understanding the bunker narrative. Regardless of the final outcome in Norway, something significant has already happened. A modern democratic government officially declared, through multiple agencies and courts, that the Watchtower's shunning practice causes documented harm. Judges examined the organization's internal videos, including the now-deleted 2017 shunning instruction video. They heard testimony from former members. They read the organization's own literature. And the Watchtower's lawyers, sitting in court beside current members, denied basic realities of witness life. They claimed that the shunning video was never meant as instruction. They claimed that elders have no real authority. They claimed that everyone is free to decide what to do. Active witnesses sat there and listened to their own lawyers contradict everything they had been taught, and they said nothing. How does the Watchtower present this to its members? As satanic persecution. As evidence that the world is turning against true religion. as confirmation that the Great Tribulation is beginning. The bunker mentality ensures that most witnesses will never read those court decisions. They will never understand what the Norwegian government actually said. They will never see their own lawyers contradicting Watchtower teachings. They will only know the organization's framing. Satan is attacking. Hide. Obey. Do not engage with outside information. In the United States, the organization faces an even more damaging threat: revelations about its handling of child sexual abuse cases. Grand jury investigations in Pennsylvania exposed the existence of internal databases containing thousands of accused abusers whose cases were never reported to secular authorities. The organizational policy required elders who learned of abuse allegations to immediately contact the Watchtower legal department. The legal department would then advise whether reporting to police was legally mandatory in that jurisdiction. In many cases, where reporting was not strictly required by law, cases were handled internally. Alleged abusers faced judicial committees, composed of elders with no professional training in investigating abuse. Victims were sometimes required to face their accusers, and detailed records were kept in files that child protection authorities never saw. This is not ancient history. This system operated for decades. Multiple elders have been criminally charged for failing to report abuse. Civil lawsuits have resulted in multimillion-dollar verdicts against the organization. And investigative journalists around the world have documented case after case of abuse that was covered up, minimized, or ignored. How does the 2025 book respond to this environment? By intensifying the language of loyalty and trust in Jehovah's representatives. By training members to view criticism of the organization as satanic attack. By creating psychological conditions where a member who reads a news story about elder misconduct will immediately dismiss it as apostate lies, rather than investigating whether it might be true. The bunker is an information quarantine. And the organization desperately needs that quarantine right now, because the information leaking in from the outside world is devastating. There is a profound theological irony in the bunker narrative that deserves examination. The Watchtower claims to follow the example of early Christianity. But the early Christians described in the New Testament behaved nothing like bunker inhabitants. Consider the prophets of the Hebrew Scriptures. Jeremiah stood in the temple courtyard and publicly denounced the religious establishment. Elijah confronted King Ahab to his face. Nathan walked into David's throne room and accused the king of murder. These men did not hide in basements. They stood in public squares and spoke truth to power, openly, at personal risk. Consider Jesus Christ. He taught openly in the temple, in synagogues, on hillsides where thousands gathered. When soldiers came to arrest him in Gethsemane, he did not flee. He asked, "Why do you come with swords and clubs as if I were leading a rebellion? Every day I was with you in the temple courts, and you did not lay a hand on me." His entire ministry was public. Consider the apostles in the book of Acts. After Pentecost, Peter stood up in Jerusalem and preached publicly to thousands. When arrested by the Sanhedrin and ordered to stop speaking about Jesus, Peter responded, "We must obey God rather than men," and then went right back to public preaching. The early church was radically, recklessly public. The Watchtower's bunker theology inverts this model entirely. Instead of public proclamation, it teaches secrecy. Instead of confronting opposition, it teaches hiding. Instead of trusting that God will protect those who speak boldly for truth, it teaches elaborate escape plans, code words, and encrypted communication. This is not apostolic Christianity. This is survivalist cult mentality. It is the theology of a group that has lost confidence in its own message and is now focused purely on institutional preservation. Let us now examine the cumulative psychological effect of the 2025 book's teachings. When you combine the lessons of illogical obedience from Joshua, family betrayal from Josiah, pre-commitment from Daniel, and martyrdom from Alfredo Fernandez, you arrive at a very specific psychological profile that the organization is trying to create. The ideal witness, according to this book, is someone who has already decided to obey organizational instructions even when those instructions do not make sense. They have already decided to cut off family members who leave. They have already committed to dying rather than accepting a blood transfusion or performing alternative service. They have already concluded that any criticism of the organization comes from Satan. They have already locked themselves inside the mental bunker. This person is psychologically incapable of leaving. Not because they have examined the evidence and concluded the Watchtower is true. Not because they have freely chosen to remain. But because every exit route has been preemptively blocked. If they try to use their reason to evaluate organizational teachings, they remember Joshua and Jericho. Logical objections are tests of faith, not valid concerns. If they feel drawn to reconnect with disfellowshipped family, they remember Josiah. Loving your family more than the organization is idolatry. If they consider changing their position on blood or neutrality when faced with death, they remember Daniel. Real faithfulness means pre-committing so that you cannot change your mind. If they hear about someone dying for a policy the organization later reversed, they remember Alfredo. He is a hero, not a victim. Every potential escape hatch has been sealed. Every natural human response, using your brain, loving your family, preserving your life, learning from mistakes, has been reframed as weakness or unfaithfulness. This is not spiritual formation. This is psychological imprisonment. And the 2025 book is the Warden's Manual. We need to speak plainly about the human cost of these teachings, because the organization speaks of courage and faithfulness while actual human beings pay the price. There are parents who have not spoken to their children in decades because one of them was disfellowshipped. Elderly mothers die without seeing the faces of their adult children. Grandparents never meet their grandchildren. Siblings become strangers. And this is presented as faithfulness. There are young people who have died refusing blood transfusions for themselves or their children. Medical professionals describe the horror of watching a patient bleed to death while effective treatment sits unused in the next room. Parents have buried children who could have been saved. And this is presented as loyalty to God. There are abuse survivors who reported their experiences to elders and were told to keep quiet, to wait on Jehovah, to maintain the peace of the congregation. They watched their abusers continue to serve in positions of authority while they themselves were treated with suspicion. And this is presented as protecting Jehovah's name. There are people who gave up educational opportunities, career prospects, and retirement savings because they were promised the end was coming within their lifetime. They are now elderly, impoverished, and dependent. The organization that told them not to plan for old age because Armageddon was imminent now sends them nothing but more magazines telling them to keep waiting. And there was Alfredo Fernandez, 19 years old, dead in military custody for refusing even to put on a uniform, following an organizational policy that the organization itself would quietly reverse 14 years later. His photograph now appears in a book asking other young people to be willing to make the same sacrifice. These are not statistics. These are human beings. They had names and faces and hopes and fears. They trusted an organization that claimed to speak for God. And that organization consumed them. Part 10. The question that matters. If you are a Jehovah's Witness watching this video, I want to ask you something. Not as an attack, not as mockery, but as a genuine human question. Do you believe that the governing body could make a mistake? The organization itself admits that it is not infallible. It acknowledges that new light replaces old understandings. It admits that past teachings have been incorrect. The flip on alternative service proves that organizational policy can be wrong, and that people can die following policy that is later reversed. If the governing body could be wrong about alternative service, could they be wrong about blood? Could they be wrong about shunning? Could they be wrong about the timeline of Armageddon? Could they be wrong about whether you should speak to your disfellowshipped daughter? And if they could be wrong, is it really faithfulness to obey without question? Or is true faithfulness actually taking responsibility for your own conscience, your own family, your own decisions, before God. The 2025 book wants you to resolve in your heart right now, while you are calm, that you will obey organizational instructions no matter what. It wants you to pre-commit so that you cannot change your mind when new information arrives or when your child's life is at stake. But what if that is exactly wrong? What if God gave you a conscience precisely so that you could evaluate moral decisions in real time? What if the ability to change your mind in the face of new evidence is not weakness but wisdom? What if the courage God wants is not the courage to silence your questions but the courage to ask them? Let me state plainly what the evidence shows. The Watchtower's shift from paradise to bunker is not a response to increased spiritual danger. It is a response to decreased institutional control. When growth rates collapsed after 1995, when the internet breached the information quarantine, when governments began examining shunning and abuse cover-ups, the organization needed a new way to retain members. Hope was not working anymore. People had been waiting for paradise since 1914, since 1925. Since 1975. Since the generation that kept getting redefined. The carrot was rotting, so they turned to the stick. The bunker is not preparation for the Great Tribulation. It is insulation from journalism, from court documents, from the testimonies of abuse survivors, from the questions of your own children when they start thinking for themselves. It is a mental construct designed to keep you from engaging with any information that might cause you to doubt. The 2025 book is a masterpiece of psychological manipulation, using carefully selected Bible stories to train you for illogical obedience, family betrayal, pre-committed decisions, and martyrdom for policies that can change. It holds up the photograph of a young man who died for a rule the organization later reversed and asks you to follow his example. This is not faithfulness. This is exploitation. And if you are inside that bunker right now, I want you to know, the door is not locked. You can leave. The world outside is not the demonic wasteland you have been taught to fear. There are people out here who will help you. There are organizations dedicated to supporting those who leave. There is life after the Watchtower, abundant and free. Alfredo Fernandez cannot make a different choice. His life was taken by an organizational policy that turned out to be temporary. But you can make a different choice. You can choose to think. You can choose to question. You can choose to love your family regardless of their organizational status. You can choose your own medical decisions. You can choose to walk out of the bunker into the sunlight. The Watchtower built the bunker to keep you in. But the latch is on your side of the door.